Bias lighting, or lighting behind your television. The idea is that bias lighting will help reduce eye strain when watching television in a dark room. But these days, it seems to be a bit more about style points than anything, right? Well, we'll talk about that and more here in a minute. But the main thing we're going to discuss today is which bias lighting system is the best. Now, there are several options out there, but the main one seems to be the Philips Hue Sync Box, which costs over $200 without any lights. So in my opinion, this one's already out. Next up, we have the do-it-yourself route using Hyperion. Or you can go with a pre-built solution from Govee, which costs around $80 for everything you need. So compared to the Philips Hue Sync Box, the Govee solution is looking mighty tempting. But can it compete with building your own lighting system? Let's find out. You know, bias lighting has actually been around for a while. In fact, some televisions in the early 2000s even had bias lighting built in. And you can still find televisions with this today. They're the Philips Ambilight televisions, but they're pretty expensive and they're kind of hard to find. Now, the Imaging Science Foundation recommends keeping your bias lighting around 10% of your television's brightest spot if you're looking to reduce eye strain. And in my opinion, if you're watching TV in a dark room, it can be more distracting than anything, especially if it's too bright. It mostly depends on what you're watching. Really, the best thing to do to reduce eye strain is to have a constant soft lighting glow rather than having the light flash and move with the video. But what's cool about both these setups we're going to look at today is you can turn them off if you find them too distracting. Now, I mostly enjoy my bias lighting when I'm watching something slow. For example, I often listen to music when I'm cooking, and I think having the lighting match the TV is honestly pretty cool. Is it necessary? Well, of course it's not necessary, but you wouldn't be here if you were looking for something necessary, now would you? So first, let's take a look at the Govee Immersion TV Backlight. This kit is made for 55 to 65 inch TVs. It works with any phone and these two voice assistants. You're welcome for not saying their name and activating them. A controller box that actually has buttons on it so you can power the lights off or have them react to music or have them light up according to what's on your television. A power cord to power it all, mounting clamps to keep your lights from falling, cleaning wipes, orange blocks, and more on these later, and a camera. And that's actually what makes the Govee lighting system so different from other bias lighting systems, is that it uses a camera to see what's on your TV. While with most other bias lighting setups, you plug in your HDMI cable into them and they see the actual signal before passing the signal along to your television. Whereas the Govee setup uses its camera to see what's on your TV. And this is actually one of the biggest appeals and advantages of the Govee setup. With the Govee, you can have as many HDMI sources as your TV will accept, because it isn't reading your HDMI signal. Whereas the Philips Hue Sync Box only has 4 HDMI inputs, and our DIY method, well, spoiler alert, it only has 1 HDMI input. So let's break this part down a bit further because I actually think this may be a deal breaker for some people. If you have 4 HDMI devices connected to your TV, then the Philips Hue Sync Box will work just fine. But if you switched over to live TV with your antenna, then the Sync Box won't work at all, because it can only read HDMI inputs. And with our DIY solution Hyperion, well, that's out after anything more than 1 HDMI input, but we'll discuss how to get around that in a minute. While with the Govee, it doesn't care what input you're on because it's using the camera to see what's on your TV. So in a lot of ways, the Govee system is more versatile and definitely way more convenient than our other options. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's talk about Hyperion real quick. Now, I won't be going step by step on how I set up my Hyperion lighting since there are probably 100 different ways you can set up Hyperion. Plus, there are so many great tutorials already out there. But I will admit, I did run into a few issues that I had a hard time finding the answer to. So if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, hopefully I can help you out. Now, for those who aren't familiar with Hyperion, it's a do-it-yourself solution for bias lighting. But since there are so many different ways of setting up Hyperion, it's hard to say exactly how much it'll cost you. My personal setup cost me around $160, but even that's hard to nail down, since I use parts and pieces from other projects. But the real question is Hyperion twice as good as the Govee setup? Well, one thing's for sure. For me, it was more than twice the headache. I probably spent more than 10 hours trying to get it all set up and work through all the bugs. Hyperion is great, but since there are so many different ways of getting it set up, it can be hard to pinpoint the issues that you may be having. Issues that I had, other people had no problem with, and vice versa. But to make Hyperion work, we need an HDMI capture card, a Raspberry Pi, LEDs, and a power supply for it all. The Raspberry Pi runs Hyperion, and the HDMI capture card reads a signal from your HDMI source and sends a copy to the Pi and a copy to the TV. The Pi then reads the signal and it decides what LEDs should do what based on the signal. This is the one area of the Hyperion setup that I think is way better than the Govee. The Govee just more or less approximates the signal that it needs to send to the lights, whereas since the Hyperion is decoding your signal, it sends a much more accurate representation of the lighting and has much more accurate colors. But Hyperion can only work with as many HDMI inputs as your capture card has, unless you get an HDMI splitter. Now, setting up Hyperion requires some soldering and a few other technical things. It's really not super complicated, but it's definitely not as easy as the Govee lighting. With the Govee, you mount your LEDs on the back of the TV, mount your controller, which is the only thing that needs power, mount your camera, and use those orange blocks to help calibrate the camera. And once you set it up in the app, you're ready to go. You can have everything up and going in about 20 minutes. I mean, really, the setup is as simple as possible. The Govee here wins by a lot. But one thing that the Govee doesn't do nearly as well is color representation. Now, a lot of that can depend on the quality of the LEDs that you get for your Hyperion setup. I used my favorite, which are the BTF RGBW LEDs. Not the cheapest way to go, but I like using RGBW LEDs since they have a dedicated white light chip along with their colored LEDs. Whereas the Govee are just RGB LEDs, which means the whites never really look white. They always have a green or blue tint to them. And the Govee lights also seem to be IP65 or at least IP55, which means they have a plastic coating on them to give them water resistance, which for something going on my TV seems a little weird since my TV isn't water resistant, and adding water resistance only heats up your LEDs, which shortens the life of your LEDs, which just means that you'll have to buy new Govee lights and... Oh, I see why they have water resistance now. But even then, when watching something, the Govee lights never really seem to be in sync with the picture. In fact, often the lights would stay on even if the screen was black. As far as the color matching experience, Hyperion definitely wins by a lot here. And those orange blocks that Govee gave us to calibrate the camera, well, taking them off definitely made me a bit nervous. The Govee lights are bright enough to use at night, but compared to the BTF lights I use, they are about half as bright. Now, the Govee lights can also react to music, whereas with Hyperion, normally it can't, but since my lights are actually WLED lights, they can react to music. I just have to do a few more steps. But this isn't something that's really important to me since I don't have too many raves at my house. Hyperion and Govee lights both have scenes that you can select. And even though technically Hyperion has more, I personally don't care for any of them on the Govee or Hyperion. Now, if you use Home Assistant, Hyperion works perfectly. And Govee is available, but you have to download the add-on through hacks. You just have to go to the Govee app and request an API key, which they send to your email in like a minute. Enter that into your Home Assistant, and then you can control your lights for the most part, which means you can add them to automations. But right now, it's only brightness and color. Whereas Hyperion and Home Assistant, you can change whether your lights display a scene, a solid color, or even use your capture device. Overall, Hyperion is way more feature-rich and accurate than the Govee system. But the Govee lighting system is so easy to set up, it's kind of hard to say no. Let me know what you think. But with that said, I'll see you in the next one.